thanks to all of you for being with us here this afternoon. As has already been stated, we generally think of immigration as a federal issue, and especially when it comes to something like a legalization program or a deferred action program, because it's only the federal government that can protect someone from deportation or change someone's immigration status. However, states and localities also have important roles and responsibilities, especially when it comes to implementing these types of programs. Now, I need to first point out that this is now an issue that all states need to be thinking about, because today there are many more unauthorized immigrants living in non-traditional immigrant-receiving states. So here on this map in dark blue, you see California, Illinois, New York, Florida, Texas, New Jersey. These are your traditional immigrant-receiving states. They had the largest absolute number of unauthorized immigrants in 1990 and in 2010. But the states here in green, including Nevada, North Carolina, Arizona, these are the states that saw the largest growth in their unauthorized population between 1990 and 2010. Texas and New Jersey, with the crosshashes, actually fall into both categories. So you can see that there are more unauthorized immigrants living in states that don't have a lot of experience with immigration policy. Similarly, with DACA, we are seeing that the largest numbers of people applying for DACA are from these traditional immigrant-receiving states, but other states like Georgia, North Carolina, Virginia are also seeing large numbers of people applying for DACA. You're going to hear more about those numbers in a bit. So in April, Pew released a paper called Immigration and Legalization, Roles and Responsibilities of States and Localities. And in this paper, we looked at two programs. We looked at the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, that was passed in 1986, and about 2.7 million people legalized under that program at that time. And we looked at DACA, which you've already heard about. And looking at these two programs, we identified 4 potential roles and responsibilities for states and localities if there were to be a new legalization program or some kind of expanded deferred action program. And these roles are outreach and public education, documentation, education, and protecting immigrants from fraud. So let's look at these one by one. First, outreach and education. States and localities can and do play a very important role in educating their communities about the program requirements, how to apply, and assisting applicants with the application process. We found that in New York, back when IRCA was being implemented, the state and local officials really actively publicized IRCA's legalization program. The Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs created task forces to identify barriers to legalization, and there was a legalization information hotline that was funded jointly by the city, the state, and the federal government. And now with DACA, we're seeing the same thing, that some states and many localities are doing town halls, they're conducting community meetings, organizing application workshops, creating informational materials in multiple languages, and otherwise trying to educate the community about DACA and the application process and help them with the application process. And I think Amalia is going to tell you more about these efforts in Illinois in a bit. The second role is documentation. And this is key. This means that states and localities are often the source of the documents that applicants need to prove that they've met the eligibility requirements. So this includes proof of a high school degree, proof that they've been living in the United States for a certain number of years. So again, during IRCA's documentation, schools, state and locally operated utilities, and other government agencies provided documents like school records, tax records, and utility bills that helped applicants prove that they had been living in the United States for the required amount of time. And now for DACA, we're also seeing that public schools are very important because they're involved in providing transcripts to students so that they can prove that they've met the education requirements or by completing high school or by getting their GED. Third is education. Public schools and community colleges may already be providing the education that applicants need to meet the program's educational requirements. Or if the program requires additional education, like IRCA did, states and localities may be providing English language classes or other types of education as well. So under IRCA, applicants had to meet English language and U.S. history and civics requirements, and states and localities were a big part of providing those classes that the applicants needed to fulfill those requirements. Now, under DACA, as Adam mentioned, applicants have to have a high school diploma or a GED or must be currently in school. And job-related English courses or other adult education courses can also be applicable, and these are things that are often coordinated by states and localities. And some are going above and beyond. Again, in New York, the City Council created additional adult education slots and prioritized unauthorized immigrants that were applying for DACA so that they could get those adult education courses that they needed to fulfill the educational requirement. Finally, protection from fraud. Protection from fraudulent or predatory immigration legal service providers. This means that states and localities can play a role in protecting immigrants from people who try to target them and charge them exorbitant fees for a service that they may or may not actually be able to provide. And we know that these types of predatory practices are common when there's a new legalization program or even when there's a rumor that such program might be passed. Currently, at least 29 states have laws that are specifically regulating the unauthorized practice of immigration law. Last year, in 2013, California passed a new law that makes it a violation for attorneys to charge immigrants in advance for any services related to a legalization program before that legalization program is actually passed by Congress. And just last week, New York enacted a law that creates new crimes and penalties for immigration assistance fraud. There are a couple of other areas where states and localities could play a role in implementation, and this includes coordinating all the efforts that are taking place amongst multiple government agencies and with nonprofit organizations that we know are doing a large amount of work with implementation as well. States and localities are monitoring the implementation and assessing ongoing needs, and they may also be assessing the future needs of a newly legalized population. We also recognize that all states and localities have not been actively promoting or implementing DACA and devoting their own resources to this. There is a great variation among states regarding the amount of funding or other resources that they're allocating to create outreach materials, for example, to reach out to their communities. And beyond the initial implementation, states and localities, of course, make other decisions regarding the broader implementation of the program. So what types of benefits and services will DACA recipients be eligible for down the line? So, for example, while most states are issuing driver's licenses to DACA recipients, at least 2 states, Arizona and Nebraska, announced that they've chosen not to issue driver's licenses to DACA recipients. It's important to recognize that the roles and responsibilities of states and localities are somewhat determined by the federal government, that even if the federal government doesn't include explicit roles and responsibilities for states and localities, the details of the program really do influence the level of involvement. And the federal government really needs to be aware of this and take states and localities into account as they move forward. So these things include the eligibility requirements. Applicants are going to have to prove that they've lived in the United States for a period of time, or that they've received a certain level of education, or that they've paid taxes. And they'll need documents in order to prove that they've met these requirements. And states and localities may be the source of the documentation that applicants will need. The timing is also important. The length of time that applicants have to get all their materials together and turn in their application is likely the same amount of time that states and localities will have to prepare for their roles and get their materials in order. DACA was implemented very quickly, just 60 days between the announcement and the first applications. Under IRCA, applicants had 1 year to meet the English language and U.S. history and civics requirements. So there's a real possibility that states and localities could be completely overwhelmed if there's a large number of people looking for these documents or these services in a short period of time. So the federal government needs to give states and localities and other service providers adequate time to prepare. And then finally, funding. Of course, we recognize that funding is an issue. There is a precedent for Congress to include funding for states and localities for implementation. In 1986, IRCA included the State Legalization Impact Assistance Grants, or SLEAG, that partially reimbursed states and localities for English language classes and other services that they provided. So the federal government needs to take all these things into account if and when they're designing some kind of new program. I just want to quickly point out that the Immigration and the States team is currently working on another project. We are looking at state implementation of new driver's license laws. So we're looking at the states that now allow them to issue driver's licenses to people who cannot prove that they're lawfully present in the United States. And as part of this driver's license process, what we're finding out is that states are already verifying identity documents, including foreign-issued documents. DMVs and other state agencies are meeting with foreign consulates to discuss the security features of foreign-issued documents. States are verifying state residency. Some states are requiring that driver's license applicants prove that they've paid taxes for a period of time in the state. So these states have set up a system to verify tax payments. The states and DMVs are reaching out to their immigrant communities in multiple languages. They're working with community-based organizations. They're providing materials in multiple languages, and they're handling large numbers of applicants and long lines at DMVs. So what we are seeing is that we think a lot can be learned from these state experiences with issuing driver's licenses to unauthorized immigrants that may be applicable to future immigration programs. So finally, and I know I'm out of time, in conclusion, all states and localities really need to be thinking about this and preparing for how they might respond if there is a new legalization program or some kind of expanded DACA program. Some states and localities are already playing a role in implementing DACA. Some states are already issuing driver's licenses to unauthorized immigrants. And in doing so, they're reaching out to applicants, they're providing them with information on how to apply, and they're providing the documentation that applicants need. So in these ways, states and localities are already preparing themselves for their roles and responsibilities in the case of a future legalization or deferred action program. So we know that policymakers have choices, and when the federal government makes choices, those decisions affect states and localities. And so we hope that today's presentations are a first step towards helping policymakers from all levels of government make informed decisions.